Hello, hello. As I, the solo gamer, returning again for some more wild and wacky retro game activity. And today we're going to be looking over a few of the more unique Genesis offerings, including a well meaning but botched arcade port, some Sonic shenanigans, a bit of Power Rangers action, and an arcade port that actually turned out pretty good. Welcome to Hard Driving. It was one of the first games to use a combination of both real physics and 3D graphics, but unfortunately, relying on 3D graphics was a mistake because the technology just was not there. On top of that, the real physics modeling meant the car slid and swerved all over the place with no means of correction. And because of how early it was in the 3D era, this game was, by all accounts, a very, very primitive version of what would later come down the pipeline. But the game was very challenging, and playing it on controller did not help. That being said, it's interesting that this game wasn't a racing game, or at least there was no actual intention behind it being a racing game. It was a time trial game, designed to be a very realistic approach at racing an actual car. Unfortunately, it also had very interesting crashes, such as kaboom! But the game was an excellent effort, and unfortunately, the technology really just wasn't there. And in a lot of ways, that was unfortunately the thing that prevented it from ever really taking off, because at the end of the day, the hard driving game was a concept that was pretty neat, pretty interesting. But at the end of the day, it came up short. Oh, whoops. Yeah, it came up short. And it's an interesting experiment, and it's fun to mess around with, but it is never going to live up to the ideals it wanted to try and push. Like, it just could not pull it off. Now, next, we're going to be dealing with the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers the movie port. Now, interestingly enough, this game was made for both the Genesis and the Super Nintendo. And unarguably, the Super Nintendo is vastly superior both sound and visuals. They both play the same, a solid beat 'em up with some interesting secondary modes, but they're both shockingly good. If the game had a single massive flaw, that flaw is its audio. It's a decent attempt, but it does not match up to the Super Nintendo's ability to almost perfectly authentically recreate the actual audio of the movie or TV show. It does, however, have a full cast, each with unique special moves, throws and grapples. And each character has a few unique moves, but they're all more or less the same. Again, the technical limitations of the Genesis become a clear indication as to what the problems were. Another issue is the game is horrifically padded. In that, because the game has limited levels and had memory restrictions that made it unable to really do more than a certain amount, the game had its flaws, and most of the levels weren't too long or too detailed, but they were decent for what they were. Each ranger, though, has their basic combo, has a basic super move, has a few hidden specials like the running slash and the blaster. And each special is unique to each ranger. Like Tommy's is a blaster fired from the sword. The Black Ranger has a cannon. The Red Ranger does an uppercut with his sword. And more or less, pretty much what you'd expect, all things being equal. But it's a solid enough game, and has decent enough combat to be quite fun. But between the two, I definitely feel like the Super Nintendo version inherently is just a better game overall, both visually and in terms of its audio. The gameplay is a little bit more complex on the Super Nintendo version and has a little bit more depth to it, so that's actually, also another point. But it's not to say the Genesis version isn't fun. It's actually a lot of fun. It just feels like it's a lesser version of a much better game. And here comes our first encounter with Ivan, and he instant kills us. Now, to its credit, they did a decent job of trying to recreate the story mode but yeah, like each of them has their own unique ability. Like she gets her bow. I love this level has like actual like hazards to it as well. But yeah, as you can see, it's a fairly straightforward beat 'em up. I mean, credit where it's due. It's visually very well done, and has an absolutely phenomenal style for the Genesis. But it is definitely brought down heavily by the Genesis's technical limitations. On top of just having lesser graphics and sound capabilities, its controller was also infinitely inferior simply for having fewer functional buttons, which made any effort to try and properly map a fighting system to it a little bit of a challenge. And it did not take advantage of the 6-button controller, which it could have, but it did not. But anyway, save this here real quick. Move on to the next item in our list. Now, next on my list is Road Blasters. Now, for those of you not familiar, Road Blasters was an incredibly popular action-packed racing shooting game in the arcades. So yeah, here's the demo. Basically, you start and you don't ever stop. And each of the levels is its own difficulty curve. Now, one thing I will say is there is absolutely no break in this game if you don't want there to be. There is a break mechanic, but a good player doesn't need it. Your primary job is to shoot everything that moves as much as you can. You grab these little green fuel balls as you go to keep yourself fueled up. The red balls will give you a big boost. Now in the arcade, this thing had a full, like, controller setup and everything. But in the home console versions, and there was in fact a version of this on the NES, which may be the more famous of the two, honestly, simply because it was more well known because the NES had a much larger, installed base at the time. But it was actually, in a rare instance, it was actually Nintendo with the vastly inferior version, because the NES just could not match the Genesis's power. And the Genesis, for all that you could say about it, was superior to the Nintendo. Like, it just was. And granted, the Super Nintendo would long eclipse the Genesis technologically, and then of course both of them would be outmatched by the PlayStation when it came along. But that didn't change the fact that, all things being equal, you had a system where the Genesis was a very powerful piece of machinery for its day. And it wasn't to say that these games weren't fun. Like, these ate up quarters like you wouldn't believe back in the arcade day. But transferring them over to a home console, their flaws became apparent. As without the consequences of the arcade, it was easy enough to just practice until you were basically unstoppable. It didn't change the fact that the game was still a fun ride and definitely had some of the best sense of speed of any game of its era. And I mean that without any joke. Like, this thing felt fast. And Nitro actually causes you to rush forward in a massive burst. But yeah, Road Blasters is one of those things that is actually worth getting on the Sega Genesis, just because it has a great port of the system and it runs very well. And I'm disappointed that, as far as I can tell, the original Road Blasters theme doesn't seem to be in the game's main systems. Maybe because it couldn't fit. But it is what it is. Now, moving on. We're going to play some Sonic Spinball. Now, Sonic Spinball was an oddity in that it was a pinball-based video game explicitly featuring Sonic. And it was, for lack of a better term, a straight-up pinball game. A very good one at that, by the way, I should note. It had a large, complex, highly detailed map with multiple levels and multiple things hidden throughout it. Also had unique save systems so that even if you did get knocked off, you could bounce back and survive it. Bag me some worms. It was also notable that the game wasn't as hard as like a traditional, your average pinball game. Like your regulation pinball game was infinitely more difficult than this game was. Didn't change the fact that it was a lot of fun. But Spinball is one of those games that I remember sinking what felt like eternities into, but I never finished. There we go. First emerald has been acquired. And then you come right back down to the beginning again. And each level is a battle to try and get yourself back to a point where you can get the next emerald. Went the wrong direction this time. But you get the idea. It's literally just Sonic Pinball. And it works really well. It's a fun game, and I'm probably going to dump hours into it in the long run. I know that much. But it's an example of how Sega was trying so hard to really create some unique and diverse games, even with the limited power that was available to this platform. Now, the Saturn would change everything, as arcade ports became an easy matter for a system with this level of support. And one of the biggest arcade ports that I remember was the Virtua Fighter series, both the remix, but also the second game, Virtua Fighter 2, came out as a port on the Saturn. Crazy as that sounds, I know. And it is a shockingly faithful port. Sarah. Now this was a direct port of the AM2 board version, I believe. I think it was the AM2 board. I'll have to check Retro Legends to see about that. But this was the first attempt. This was the first attempt to port a full-on arcade game straight to the home console at as close as it could be. And I think they did an excellent job. Now, I'd be lying if I said that there weren't flaws. Like, some of the character models are a little bit less detailed, and the backgrounds feel a little bit less clear. But to be fair, that could just be my nostalgia talking. Voice work hasn't improved, but that was nothing new. They did do a decent job trying to make sure the weather effects are still on point. Got her. But as rare as it is, it was incredibly rare to see a near perfect arcade port in the home console. Even in the PlayStation and Saturn era, there was always limitations because either the board's hardware couldn't be converted, or you just didn't have the capacity for the memory. It just wasn't the same. But this was, for its era, this was still one of the best like fighting games ever produced, and it was a generational step in technology. It was also one of the biggest multiplayer fighting games at the time because the lack of like super moves and fireballs and all that nonsense meant that the game came down purely to your understanding of the characters and your skill. And as I've noted before, I'm mid at fighting games. I love them. I think they're amazing. But I am mid tier at best. And it's clear if you watch me play, as much as I enjoy them, I am just not good at them. What's funny is Shun was always my favorite back in the day, him and Sarah. So fighting against Shun is a hard road to go, because he's the character I used to play the most. What can I say? I love drunken boxing. It's a very unique fighting style. But this was a game that I probably in the arcade put in quite a bit of money over the years. So having the actual like physical copy of it feels like a breath of fresh air. Especially given that when I was growing up and when I was still young, I never had a Saturn because they were always too expensive or they were very difficult to get by the time I started getting into them. And even when I did have them, the only one I could get was a import one out of Japan. So you made do with what you had. And of course, it wasn't the only Virtua Fighter game that came out. The remix was of course legendary, but the Saturn really did see a surge in gaming at that time. But even then, there was still other games trying to break through, and like near the end of its life, the PC Engine CD did see a number of ports from other games. Given its affiliation with Hudson Soft, anything that came to Hudson Soft, even if it was for the Neo Geo, would also come to this platform. Unfortunately, because of this game's inherent limited control scheme, the game was much harder to play than its predecessors. It's also notable that the sound quality of this was vastly inferior to its predecessors. Although the credit where it is due, they did a decent job of doing the voice work. Gotcha. But yeah, World Heroes is especially well known as being one of the oddball fighting games of the Neo Geo Neo Geo era. Now this is a Japanese import. This is not an English version because they didn't release this platform in large quantities in the American market, and the games were exceptionally rare. But this was one of those games that had its unique gimmick, and that unique gimmick was the death match. And it's like, you notice how this game has detailed and animated backgrounds, even if they are basic. And then you got the two ring girls who are apparently two sets of identical twins. I mean, it was what it was. Like, this was a time when they had the limited technology of the era made them have to do what they had to do. But this was, I remember playing this in the arcade. And while it's not anywhere close to the arcade version, it's a decent port, especially given the limited technology of the PC Engine. But yeah, this is another example of how the gaming industry has changed and gotten weird over the years, and how there was a lot less concern about, offending people or anything. Like, seriously, meet the Makoto knockoff here. And you cannot convince me that isn't Makoto from Street Fighter 3. I'm sorry. She's literally just it's just literally the same character, just in a different game. But like she's literally just Makoto knockoff. And I mean, hey, fine, tomboy martial arts girl is not exactly an unknown trope. But you get what I'm getting at. But this was the era where these games were all over the map, and you can see that. Like, here's one of the last great 2D fighting game eras in the 90s. And the real bout Garo Densetsu, or as we would know it, real bout Fatal Fury, would essentially be an example of that made into its absolute best form. Now, this was the original version, and it was essentially a remake of Fatal Fury, with some added characters and extras from other titles. But yeah, it was straight up just Fatal Fury. That being said, if you want to see what the actual OG Mai Shiranui looked like, This is probably one of the best games with her in it. And of course, this was one of the experiments where they gave her a different outfit that was similar to her original outfit, but with some slight modifications. I honestly think it's one of her best outfits, personally. But as far as the fighting game genre went, this was the era in which the fighting game was at its absolute pinnacle, in my opinion, and everybody was trying to get in on that money. To be fair, I do not remember how to do the super moves in this game. But this game had all kinds of great special effects for knockouts, victories. You knock certain characters in the water, their clothes come off, but they're in the water, so you can't see anything. So the game had a sense of humor and knew what it was all about. But there was actually a follow-on, Ryobout Gara Densetsu Special, which took that original game and expanded it further. And this is supposed to be the follow-on to Fatal Fury 2 with Krauser. Yeah, there he is. Now this game was, by all accounts, the definitive edition of the Fatal Fury series before it moved to the the 3D era. But you can see, like, this had the largest roster, 20 plus characters, including Mai, and it also had a modified art style with a little bit more. It had a little bit more focus on its pixel work, and was less concerned with smoothing out the characters than making them move fluidly. So it was actually interesting work. But if you look, the details are fantastic. But it is definitely pixel art, and you can definitely tell, like, this was right as that era was ending. Now, that being said, I do not know any of her moveset. In fact, I have no idea what I'm doing. She also had a very different moveset in this game than from what I remember. But yeah, this is the old school, like, this is the original Mai. And to be fair, like, this was the one I grew up with. This is the version of her I remember seeing in arcades and seeing on collections for the Neo Geo series. In a lot of ways, I actually feel like the Neo Geo series making a comeback is kind of an impressive thing, because it represents the fact that this series had its following, and it kind of lost that following because a lot of people forgot this game was out there. But yeah, it was definitely a unique product of its era. But this was this is the Mai we remember. And I mean, it's actually the version that they based her OVA variant on when the OVAs came out. But it's a great example of how the gaming industry has sort of, pardon the expression, lost its balls over the years. There was a recent article about the new Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines game, and all I could do was shake my head, because they're binning stuff, they're binning plans behind a paywall and a pre-order, and they got so much shit for that they had to back out of it. But it's a perfect example of do not look at the game itself. Look at all this stuff we're doing, and then it's like when you look at the game, it's shit. It's absolute trash. So, but anyway, I got another video coming up beyond this, and it's going to be coming out soon. I recently got my hands on the Wing Commander 3 for the PS1, and so with that, my PS1 Wing Commander series is basically complete. So I'll be sharing that soon too. Anyway, I just wanted to share some of my updated retro gaming goodness, and if you're interested in more detailed on any of these games, let me know. Otherwise, this is the Solo Gamer signing out. I will see you next time. Bye.